This show is going to be so amazing for you because we're going to talk about how to get more focused, how to save time, and how to get more done. Oh my God, can't we all use that? So stay tuned as we dive in with Jay Papasan.
Welcome to Thriving Launch with Louise Congdon and Kamala Chambers. This show for heart-centered entrepreneurs who want it all.
5 days a week, we bring you different segments to inspire you to live a life of freedom. We interview the leading experts in the field of business, health, and love. Be sure to check out Training Tuesdays, where we give you a clear action plan to grow your own business. Maybe you can relate to this. When I was a full-time coach, keep repeating the same things to people over and over and over again, and it got to be kind of draining, and I wasn't really enjoying what I was doing anymore. So what I decided to do was record the things that I had to tell clients over and over and over again, and then I packaged those recordings together and sold them as an online course. If you're interested in creating and selling your own online course, head over to thrivinglaunch.com, and I have a free training for you on how to create and make passive income through your own online course.
He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's been on over 175 media appearances, ranging from all the news stations you can imagine, large publications, and now we have him here on Thriving Launch to talk to you, all of us, about how we can save time and how we can actually utilize time in a much richer and stronger way. This interview for me was really special because Jay just really shows up and he's full of heart, passion, and love. So we're excited to bring you to Thriving Launch with Jay Papasan.
It's so awesome to have you here, Jay Papasan. Welcome to Thriving Launch. You ready to launch?
I am so ready to go. Thanks for having me.
So Jay, you wrote this book. People are loving it. I mean, I was just checking it out on Amazon and it's got nearly 1,500 reviews for the audiobook. It's nuts. People are raving about this. And for me, it's, it seems very appropriate that people are crazy about this book right now because the one thing is urging us to slow down. Now, without giving away the book and asking the question and giving away, for me, what I'm curious about, what is the one thing? I mean, why do you think people love this book so much?
I think that Gary and I were fortunate enough to put this out at a time when people needed it, right? I think that we look up and everything is accelerating so fast. I think about your audience. You mentioned people who are entrepreneurs and self-starters who are looking to improve their lives, the amount of information that's available to us, the opportunities. And in some ways, I'm getting to that place where I not only have kids, but older parents, the obligations that we face. I think there's a lot of overwhelm going on. And so what we need is a mechanism to help us filter out a lot of the noise so we can focus on the few things, often the one thing that really matters the most. And I think that's why it's kind of resonating. And it's just that we got the right time in our lives, this moment in history when the world is advanced a little faster than we can adapt to it.
One of the things that I really got from your book is how important it is for me to identify the key and essential actions, behaviors, whatever it might be for me to accomplish my goal and for me to try to really identify that you've been referring it to as extreme Pareto.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Pareto's Law briefly. Tim Ferriss is a big fan of Pareto's Law. What is Pareto's Law and why do you advocate an extreme version of it?
It's kind of the ultimate success law. It would be like in the world of physics, we have gravity. In the world of accomplishment, we have the 80-20. It comes from an Italian economist, I think it was in the 18th century, Vilfredo Pareto, observed that 80% of the wealth in Italy was held by 20% of the people. And that little observation by obscure economists lay dormant until a guy named Joseph Juran heard about it while studying executive compensation. And he was a big quality control guy. And his huge aha was, oh, wait, when I look at the assembly lines, like 80% of the defects come from 20% of the flaws. And he immediately knew that there was something bigger there. So it was actually in his manual on quality control that it got popularized. And I want to say in the mid-'80s, the 80-20 principle book was written. And that's where I know Gary Keller was exposed to it, my co-author. And what you basically need to understand is there's a minority of what we do that gets us the majority of what we want. The 80 and the 20, I think those numbers kind of confuse people because they don't always show up. They do a lot, but there's a minority of what we do. So what we want people to do is look at that to-do list. And instead of just marching through it, right, like we often do, which is to cross off the stuff we can do the fastest or the easiest, most of us are working to make it shorter, to put it into some sense of priority. If I can only get one thing done today, what's that thing? And that becomes your number one. And if I can only get two things done today, what's that number two? And most people will go from a list like that goes as long as a page, 20 or 30 things, down to like 4 or 5 really essential ones. And they know what their number one is. And that's their 20%. And we just want to say, and what's the 20% of that and the 20% of that until they know exactly what their number one priority is. That's extreme Pareto.
This is so brilliant because one thing, whenever we ask thriving launchers, what's the one thing that they're suffering from most? It's overwhelm. Yeah. Entrepreneurs and coaches and authors and speakers, everybody's got a million things to do, and there's a million things to grow your business and to make it better and all of it. So I love that this is the same thing that I apply is how I get a lot done is what is the number one, what is the top 3 things that I absolutely need to do today and focus on those. So that's fantastic. I'd love to hear more from you about people that are full of passion and full of desire, and they have all these different ideas. What would you really say to that group of people?
Well, the first thing is, when we called the book The One Thing, I remember going to the book expo in New York, and all the cynical New York publishers were just laughing. Like, there's never just one thing, right? We all have too many things on our plate. So one of the metaphors in the book is this idea of a domino run. And so I'm going to get exactly to your answer here, Kamala. It's just the idea is I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of stuff on the list. And as entrepreneurs and self-starters, we kind of feel like we do have to get to them all. But when you line them up properly, just like you've probably done with dominoes at home, one thing I'll actually knock over a bunch of stuff. And that's the secret truth behind the idea of this Pareto's principle, or in our case, the one thing. When people make a stand and say, you know what, for my new business, my number one thing is I'm going to be working, I don't know, cold media, right, to drive traffic to my website. And I'm going to give that all of my focus. That's where I'm going to start my days. That's going to be like all of my energy. When people actually live that commitment, there's a halo effect. By taking real control over that priority, they end up doing a lot of the other important stuff just by default. And it's just amazing how when you flip the conversation from all the stuff that they have to do to this one essential thing that they must do, all the stuff still gets done. So I think that's the first message people need to hear, because they look at that list, they get it intellectually, but they can't get past the fact that numbers 20 and 21 still have to get done. And I'm just promising you, if you'll live it, even for a short period of time, like you're talking about, you're doing your top 3. I learned that from Tim Ferriss. Peter Drucker actually espoused that a long time ago too. But when you live those priorities, all that other stuff either goes away completely or it just kind of gets done without you having to give it a lot of energy.
I'm going to back you up here and say this absolutely works. I'm able to get so much done this way. And I know there's the desire to try to do everything, and we pile it all on, and people just get burnt out.
Yes.
What do you think passion, desire, or inspiration has to do with this?
When someone truly sees a vision for their life, right, that often evokes this need to be making progress towards it. And it can be hungry and impatient, especially among entrepreneurs. They're almost fidgety about it. And so if they can't, I don't know, I'm trying to make sure I'm saying this in the most best possible way. This idea of being really active often takes priority over being productive, activity over productivity. And what we're trying to get them to do is just start with the big one, right? Start with those top 1, 2, or 3. And what I love about that when we go back to the overwhelm is on those days when I know I knocked out my priority and I got it done before noon, right? Because I launched my day with it. I feel kind of righteous the rest of the day. There is this sense of satisfaction that I know that my number one priority got checked off already. And even if I have a bad afternoon, I don't feel the same way I do as if that's still hanging over my head at 3 o'clock. And then I get it done right before I get home. Just flipping the conversation to let's start with the most important thing. I don't know, it just relieves a lot of stress for me.
As I'm hearing you two kind of go back and forth here and talk about this one thing and the extreme Pareto, I can't help but feel this sense of like you two are more enlightened than me, because I'm the kind of person that has on my computer, I have maybe 10 tabs open. I flip back and forth through the different tabs, through different tasks, and I get this hit of inspiration. Oh, I got to make this call. And so I'll stop what I'm doing in the different tabs. And I can't help but feel, and I'm curious from you, do you find this sometimes with people? I can't help but feel this sense of like, oh my God, this could potentially threaten my way of doing things that feels like it's being successful, but is it really being successful? Have you found that, people like myself who kind of cringe at the idea of trying to shrink down my to-do list so much that then I just feel like, oh my God, what about the other things? And I know you kind of touched on this. What has your experience been with all of that? If that makes sense, what I'm asking.
All right, I'm going to go tough first, and then I'm going to let you completely off the hook.
All right.
One of the big ahas.
Wait. Don't let him off the hook. Please don't.
No, but it's like, this is coming from like your coach, from the person who cares a lot. Most people are really successful in spite of most of what they do. So I think when we look up, we're kind of aware of all the things we do, and we're unaware of the stuff that we're doing unconsciously. But like, you're successful, you're nailing it. So you look up and say, this program can't be that broke. And we're all a little resistant to change. But the reality is everybody could be a lot more efficient. And so we're not advocating that people become robots. We're not advocating that they lose that sense of creative wonder. I'm a writer. I mean, when you described 20 tabs or whatever, I've got you beat. I have a browser and it's just got all these articles open. And when I'm in creative mode, I'm kind of wandering through that. That's a state of mind that's very important to me, but it has its place. We're just asking people, launch your days with priority. So you don't have to be this way all day. In fact, people can't sustain it. It's not sustainable to be that focused all the time. But when you wake up in the morning, we have a thing called the focusing question. What's the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary? Sounds like Kamala is like, she's figured that out. Like, she kind of knows what that is for her. The rest of us kind of have to ask. Sometimes they have to ask every day. You go to that list, you figure out your 1, your 2, your 3, and you just start there. And when you do those things, that's when I coach people. We have a whole chapter on multitasking, right? I'm not asking you to stop multitasking all the time, but when you know you're working on your number one priority, it's probably a good idea not to have Twitter open while you're doing that. So just a small dose of extreme focus has magnificent benefits for the rest of your day. So that would be like, you don't have to abandon your work style. We're asking for one adjustment. Launch your work period, whatever that is, your day, launch it with your number one priority and see how that doesn't change everything for you. Does that make you feel better?
I know that's totally awesome. And that question to me is such a beautiful question because, one of the things that Kamala and I really focus on is having a lifestyle that has enough freedom so that we can travel the world, we can automate parts of our business, we can connect with people, but we also have plenty of time to choose and pick and have what we want in regards to our business, our private life, our relationship. And I think that we are asking that question. When you asked that question, I was like, that's a question I love asking myself on a regular basis.
It eliminates a lot. I mean, I think that one of the titles we kicked around at one point was just clarity, that the people who tend to achieve the most in life seem to have the clearest idea of where they're going, even if it's just like north. They don't even know what the destination is, but they know they're supposed to go north. When you ask yourself a question like the focusing question that really forces you to narrow it down to one thing, it does give you a sense of where your priorities lie. And just by that default, that little exercise I role played earlier, by knowing out of all this stuff on your to-do list that there is a 1, 2, 3, maybe even a 4 and a 5, what it lets you know is all this other stuff isn't as important. And you get both those benefits, the clarity about what is in you really should be in your sights, and the other stuff that you might be doing for fun, but you can also just kind of let it lie. So there's just so many benefits to just that little bit of taking a moment. And I tell people, just get an egg timer. I've got one on my Google, right? On my Chrome. I've just got it bookmarked for egg timer. I'll set a timer for like 3 minutes. I'll go to my task sheet and say, what is my number one? And that's just a little exercise I can do. And it doesn't take any longer than that to identify your priority. What I always say is most people know what it is, but because they don't stop long enough to ask the question, they just walk around feeling guilty for not addressing it.
For everybody listening too, we'll make sure to add a link over on the thrivinglaunch.com on the show notes page, a link to some Chrome extensions that you can use to help you utilize and save time better. Another thing that just happened that's really awesome for me here, Jay, is that I just got coaching. You guys listening, this is why I encourage people to podcast, is we just got done having a coaching session and I feel more clear about how I want to wake up and do my quote unquote to-do list, because I'm the kind of person that makes these long lists with a bunch of boring stuff on there that I'm just like, oh, that'll get done the fastest. I'll do that one first. But what you've really kind of helped me kind of rewire myself for is what's the one thing, the two and the three, what are these one things that I can wake up, and if I do these, they're the most leverage for my time, and they're the kinds of things that would potentially eliminate everything else.
Yep, you got it. That's the simplest form of the process. If you wanted to take it like one notch up to make those things, now you know what your priorities are, or priority ideally. You want to kind of time block it, which all it means is make an appointment with yourself to do that every day. And I'm betting that you probably do this. There's probably some rituals to your mornings, that there's things that you do on a regular basis most days, whether it's just meditating or working out or how you do your breakfast or maybe even just how you fix your coffee. But when I looked at and we interviewed some of the most successful people in the world, a lot of them made their one thing a ritual. They had a standing appointment that the first thing they did in their office, or often before they got to it, they were already addressing that thing. And in our research, and I could go into the long research, but there was a study in the British Journal of Psychology, Health Psychology. If you just make that appointment in time, you just navigate when you're going to do the thing you know you have to do, you're about 3 times more likely to do it. Just that simple act triples your effectiveness.
Really powerful. I'm wondering, what are some of the biggest stumbling blocks that people come across when they try to implement this?
Okay, so the biggest challenges. First and foremost, just a willingness. They can intellectually get the 80-20, but if they aren't willing to kind of be accountable to it, to hand themselves over to it, they'll often stumble because they've maybe blocked off an hour each morning to try to focus on their priorities. This is going to be my working on the business time, right? Or working on myself time, whatever your priority is, not the other stuff. And then a fire breaks out. Something urgent but unimportant happens. And that is probably the moment of truth for a lot of people. They're going to stumble a few times. They're going to get distracted. And then they're going to think, well, this thing doesn't really work. I encourage folks, and in our programs, to try to string together a series of days. Just give it a couple of weeks and see if you don't start to see results. I mean, really rapidly, but that instinct to go jump on whatever the fire is, an argument or something happens on social media, if you can just kind of shut all of that away just for a few days in a row, you'll look up at the end of those days and you'll see the results for what they are. It shows up much faster than people anticipate. So it's battling those distractions. That's got to be the number one thing.
This really reminds me of the interview that we're going to be having here shortly with Dr. Gay Hendricks. And we're going to be talking with him about his book and in his own breakthrough that he wrote about in his book called The Big Leap. And inside that book, he's talking about a very similar thing that you're talking about. For him, the big leap is identifying what your zone of genius is, that one thing that just you light up and it has the most leverage for you and your business, and finding ways that you can just do that and do less of everything else. And it really speaks to the same thing. You know, it's really fascinating that your book, at a time when, you know, we have a lot of tabs open, we're constantly bombarded with social media, we have our phones, we have friends, like most of the things that we're doing, we're trying to multitask all the time. We're driving, we're listening to music, we're on a phone call, we're listening to the GPS. And your book comes out at a time that it seems like everything is pulling us the opposite way. And then your book comes and people are really loving it.
Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, I think that we identified 6 lies between people and success. That was kind of the convention we used. And the number 2 one was multitasking. And when I give keynotes or when we're teaching material, it's probably the one that most universally people are like, well, that's me. We're all kind of guilty of it. It's the age we live in. I mean, right now, I can't walk through the park without people bumping into you because they're playing Pokemon Go when they're supposed to be walking their dog, right? So you've got this thing going on. Again, I just say, if you know what your number 1 priority is, can you just take a moment and say, can I create a bunker for myself? Is there a place? I know this is important. This is what your next guest is going to talk about. If it's truly your passion, it's worth making this one investment so that you can do it right. And one of the areas that it hit home for me, this applies to every area of your life. I looked at, as a working dad, what's the one thing I can do to make sure that I'm constantly engaging with my kids at these different areas? And for many years, I wanted to have bedtime, right? I wanted to read to them every single night. And a kid will teach you, you can't multitask. You can't have your phone out and be reading them a book, right? And well, now, yeah, see, you laugh, but it's so true. Like, we could get it, and we would tell our kids to behave this way. And when we're at our best as parents, we behave that way with our kids.
I can't multitask. I can't multitask with Kamala either. If I try to have a conversation with her and I pull out my phone, she's like, which conversation are you having? The phone or with me? You got to decide. And I'm like, I'm just responding to someone really quick. I can listen to you.
I will not talk to anyone if they're on their phone.
God bless you for that, right? I mean, I think I have like all these intellectual reasons, like that we really point out, like 28% of your day is lost to this ineffectiveness. You lose on average, I think, like 6 to 10 IQ points when you're multitasking. I can go through all the science on that. But the thing that hits home for people was actually a little line at the end of that chapter, and you're hitting on it now, is that the things that actually matter the most are our relationships, the people that we love the most. And when we can't even give them the respect of our full attention, what is that saying about how we're going to succeed or fail in those relationships? So good for you on calling our friend Luis on that. I've been called on it. You know, my Mets are in the World Series or whatever, and I'm really wanting to have my phone out under the table. I get it. But we don't want to be that person in the moments of truth of our life that matter most. And that's the whole point of this book. You don't have to be perfect all the time. You don't even have to be perfect. If you can just live your priorities meaningfully in little tiny doses of time, you would be amazed how much farther we get. So, I love that you've been called on that. We all have. But being aware of it, we don't always treat our work with that much respect. And if it's our life's work, our life is at risk then, right? Just like our relationships would be. And that's what I try to tell people. Give your work that much respect as well.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And you love that he's been called on it, but he doesn't like it. So
I don't like it when I've been called on it. Yeah. I know it's good for me, right? That comes from love, right? Often the people that love us most are the ones who call us when we're out of line.
I have a question that's kind of a side note here. You were talking about the research behind people's IQ getting lower when they're multitasking.
Yeah.
And, there's research about women are natural multitaskers. Have you seen anything of the difference between the IQ drop between the sexes?
No, I haven't seen it broken out. What I know is that is largely a myth. And it's when we talk about something, I think it was Stephen Colbert that coined the word truthy.
Truthiness?
It sounds true, right. It sounds true, therefore it must be true. And the idea that women are better multitaskers because they had to tend to the kids while they were in the fields for millennia, it makes sense, therefore we want it to be true. But I actually don't think there's any proof that they're any better at multitasking than men.
All right, listeners. I want to hear what you listeners have to say about that. Make sure to write in and
there you go. There's your controversy right there.
Oh man. The drama. No.
So, before we wrap up here, Jay, I have a question, because as we've been talking about being single-mindedness and picking out the things that we're really good at, or the activities and tasks that for us will give us the most power. I've heard this from a lot of people that are successful, from Arnold Schwarzenegger to Tim Ferriss and a variety of other really incredibly successful people, where you mentioned it briefly, where you set a timer for 2 or 3 minutes just to kind of think about your success list and your things that you're going to be writing down as your 1 or 2 or 3 things that are really important for you. Have you found that if we set aside 20 minutes or 15 minutes and focus on that one task, are we more successful? Is there a certain amount of time that you found that on average is the best amount of time for most people? What do you think about this?
Well, I think you're referring to the Pomodoro method, and I've definitely played with that. And that's this idea that we kind of need to break our focus every 20 to 25 minutes, and then we get kind of a fresh spurt of focus. What I know is that focus is a muscle. It's like a fast twitch muscle in that it diminishes in strength very rapidly. But I also know that if you're going back to, again, your future guest, when we're in our passion zone and we're working at the edge of our abilities, you've also heard the term flow, correct?
It's such a beautiful state to be in.
Yes. When we're at that edge of our abilities, we do lose track of time. And I personally, I want to hit flow when I'm writing and researching. So I do not set clocks for that sort of work, because I can achieve flow there. My work is best when I achieve flow, and I really don't want anything jarring me out of it. Mm. So this is, I have very little science. This is my personal experience. So for those things where flow matters, right? This idea of getting in the zone, if you aren't familiar with it, but it's a huge, huge asset when we can get there. And you have to be pushing to the edge of your abilities. And it usually is something like a hobby or a passion work that we can lose ourselves in. That's amazing. But for things like email, right? I try to get into email and social media during 3 windows throughout the day. I usually set a clock of 20 to 25 minutes, because in my experience with the volume of messages and things that are happening, that is work that truly will expand to whatever time I give it. So I just limit it. And that, I'm like, now I'm playing a game. How many emails can I complete before that clock goes out? So that's that idea. I think they call it batching, right? So for things that tend to be a little bit repetitive, we're not really going to get into flow unless it's just how quickly we can do them. I love using timers for that, to kind of quickly, effectively get it off my plate and then move to the next thing. So that's my 2 philosophies: big blocks of time for my most important work, little blocks of time for the kind of task-oriented stuff.
Beautiful. It's been really wonderful to hear your insight. And we don't always need hard science to prove something to us. I mean, our own experience is enough. And I'm in total agreement with everything you just said. We're about to wrap up, Jay. I'm curious, do you have any last messages for the audience? Anything that you feel that you kind of want to recap, or anything that we kind of left missing out as we wrap up here?
I would just encourage people, if this is resonating for you, if you're thinking of something that maybe you should be doing that you're not doing, is just make a commitment to try to do it tomorrow. I think that when people effectively take even one step towards self-improvement, but they do it within a very short period of time, like 24 hours, the odds go through the roof that they're going to continue. Because often the first step is why they tell you to put your running shoes by your bed, right? Just the first act, that first domino, can create just enough momentum to keep you going. So if that's been kind of haunting you, and a lot of people will come out of the audience or say they've read the book and like, oh, I realized I was neglecting this relationship, or I was neglecting this, then just make a commitment right now to make even the tiniest amount of progress tomorrow or today, but no later, and see what happens from that.
Thank you so much for that. It's been a blast having you on the Thriving Launch podcast. We're going to make sure that we include everything that Jay's talked about today, the resources, links to your book. As always, Thriving Launchers, you can head over to thrivinglaunch.com to get that. It's been fantastic having you on the show. Thank you for talking about the one thing with us and getting us all more focused.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Thriving Launch podcast. For books and resources related to today's episode, make sure to head over to thrivinglaunch.com. We'll see you there.
Have you heard of Bulletproof Coffee? Have you heard of Dave Asprey? If you're someone that likes health, simplifying life, or enjoys business, you're going to want to listen to our next interview with Dave Asprey. So be sure to tune in. And as always, subscribe to the show so you get our updates right away.